The black woman was sent instead of her stepsister as mail-order bride, and when the rugged cowboy saw her step down from that dust-covered stagecoach, his face twisted with disgust. The gathered crowd mutters cruel disappointments. They expected someone pale and proper, not this dignified woman with intelligent eyes. They assume she'll be cast aside like yesterday's newspaper, sent back on the next train to wherever unwanted things disappear. But the broad-shouldered rancher needs more than just a wife. His failing land demands skills no ordinary bride possesses. What neither the sneering townspeople nor the reluctant cowboy realize is that this unexpected woman carries secrets in her traveling trunk, knowledge that could transform their dusty settlement or destroy the powerful men who control it. Will her hidden abilities save them both, or will the conspiracy that sent her here crush any chance of redemption? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. Clarabelle's fingers traced the edges of her father's surveying compass, hidden beneath folded linens in her traveling trunk. The Larson mansion had grown quiet around her as she packed by candlelight, knowing tomorrow would change everything. Margaret had made her decision clear that afternoon, with a voice sharp as winter wind. "You'll take my place on that stagecoach, Clara. Consider it charity." The words still stung. Clara understood the real reason. Margaret had discovered her reading their father's old railroad maps, mathematical notations scrawled in margins that revealed far more than property lines. Knowledge was dangerous in the wrong hands, or perhaps the right ones. The morning stagecoach to Arizona Territory lurched forward with Clara inside instead of her golden-haired stepsister. Miles of desert stretched endlessly as dust caked the windows. Clara steadied herself against each bump, knowing she traveled toward either freedom or deeper servitude. No middle ground existed for someone like her. Redemption Falls appeared as a collection of weathered buildings scattered across the plateau like dice thrown by careless gods. The stagecoach wheezed to a stop outside the general store. Clara smoothed her traveling dress and lifted her chin. Dignity would be her shield, whatever awaited outside that door. She stepped down to a crowd of expectant faces that soured immediately. Whispers rippled through the gathered townspeople like stones dropped in still water. They had come to welcome Margaret Larson, the pale bride from Denver. Instead, they found Clarabelle, dark-skinned and defiant under their stares. A giant of a man pushed through the crowd. Samuel Gideon stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders that could carry fence posts. His weathered face twisted with confusion, then disgust. This was the mail-order groom, the rancher who had paid good money for a wife to help establish his failing homestead. "This ain't right," his voice carried across the silent street. "I ordered someone else." Clara's stomach clenched, but her spine remained straight. She had expected rejection. Living as a stepdaughter in the Larson household had taught her to expect disappointment from men who believed they owned women like livestock. Jeremiah Tucker emerged from the crowd, his banker's suit pristine, despite the desert dust that coated everything else. His smile held no warmth as he approached Gideon with the confidence of a man who controlled purse strings. "Send her back, Sam. I can arrange proper introductions with suitable ladies from back east. No need to settle for inferior goods." The words cut deep, but Clara refused to flinch. She had survived worse insults in drawing rooms filled with Denver society ladies who treated her like furniture with ears. These desert dwellers would not break what years of subtle cruelty had already tested. An older woman stepped forward from the crowd. Mrs. Abernathy wore a simple dress and kind eyes that saw past skin color to character underneath. Her husband preached at the local church, and she carried herself with quiet authority that came from feeding the hungry and comforting the grieving. "The girl needs shelter while this gets sorted." Her voice brooked no argument. Christian folk don't leave travelers stranded, regardless of circumstances. Gideon's jaw worked like he was chewing tough meat. His ranch struggled without proper help, and the money he had spent on bride arrangements left his coffers nearly empty. pride warred with practicality behind his dark eyes. Clara gathered her skirts and lifted her trunk. She would not beg these people for acceptance. Margaret had taught her that begging only invited more cruelty. "I appreciate your kindness, ma'am, but I can make my own arrangements." Mrs. Abernathy studied Clara's posture and speech patterns. Education showed in small details that most folks missed. The way Clara held her shoulders, how she pronounced each word clearly despite obvious distress. This was no ordinary servant girl, despite what circumstances suggested. Tucker leaned closer to Gideon, his voice dropping to what he thought was a whisper. "Cut your losses, Sam. Send her packing, and I'll help arrange something proper. A man of your standing needs the right kind of wife." The crowd began dispersing as afternoon heat made standing in dusty streets uncomfortable. Clara found herself alone with 3 people who would determine her immediate future. Gideon, who saw her as damaged goods. Tucker, who saw her as a problem requiring disposal. Mrs. Abernathy, who saw her as a fellow human being deserving basic decency. "You'll stay with us tonight." Mrs. Abernathy's decision was final. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next." Clara nodded gratefully, but her mind was already working. She had learned to read people during her years in the Larson household. Tucker's eagerness to remove her seemed excessive for a simple case of mistaken identity. His eyes held calculation that went beyond concern for Gideon's marital prospects. As they walked toward the modest parsonage, Clara's hand instinctively moved to her trunk, where her father's surveying tools lay hidden beneath carefully folded dresses. Those instruments represented knowledge that could change everything in a territory where land meant power and power meant survival. Behind them, Tucker continued whispering poison into Gideon's ear while the big rancher's expression grew darker. Clara had seen that look before in Denver drawing rooms when men discussed business they thought women could not understand. She understood more than they imagined. The question now was whether that understanding would save her or destroy her in this unforgiving place where second chances came as rare as desert rain. Clara woke before dawn in Mrs. Abernathy's spare room. Voices carried from the street outside where angry men gathered near the general store. She recognized the problem immediately. Land disputes in growing territories always followed the same pattern. Someone drew lines where lines had never existed before. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Abernathy stood at the kitchen window, wringing her hands as she watched the commotion build. "Harwell and Morrison are fixing to shoot each other over that boundary line. Sheriff's 3 towns over and won't be back for days." Clara studied the 2 merchants gesturing wildly at each other across a disputed fence line. Their argument had drawn half the town, including Samuel Gideon, who stood with arms crossed, watching the conflict unfold. Tucker circulated through the crowd like a vulture, no doubt calculating how to profit from whatever resolution emerged. "May I see the property documents?" Mrs. Abernathy looked surprised. "You can read legal papers?" Clara had read far more than legal papers in her father's study while Margaret practiced piano downstairs. Railroad contracts, survey reports, government land grants that carved territories into profitable parcels. Her father had believed knowledge belonged to anyone willing to earn it, regardless of what society deemed proper. She walked outside and approached the arguing merchants. Both men held crumpled papers that looked more like grocery lists than official documents. Their fence line wandered drunkenly across the disputed ground, following no logical survey markers. "Gentlemen, may I examine your boundary descriptions?" Harwell, the baker, looked at her like she had sprouted wings. Morrison, who ran the dry goods store, laughed outright. The crowd murmured disapproval that the unwanted mail-order bride was inserting herself into men's business. Clara ignored their reactions and studied both documents. The legal language was poorly written, but the mathematical descriptions were clear enough. Both men had been measuring from different reference points, creating an overlap that existed only in their confused surveying attempts. "Your boundary line should run 12 degrees northeast from the large boulder, not due north from the creek bed." She pointed toward a sun-bleached rock that both men had ignored in their measurements. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, patient and precise, as he taught her to read landscape like a book written in stone and water. The creek shifts seasonally, but that boulder has anchored this corner for decades. Your property lines don't actually overlap if you measure correctly. Gideon stepped closer, his expression shifting from skepticism to curiosity. How do you know about surveying? Clara felt every eye in the crowd focusing on her. This moment would either establish her value or confirm their worst assumptions about her presumption. She had hidden her education for years in the Larson household, playing the role of simple servant while Margaret took credit for accomplishments that weren't hers. My father was Samuel Roberts, chief surveyor for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. He taught me to read land the way most people read newspapers. The crowd stirred with surprise. Railroad surveyors commanded respect throughout the territory. Their work determined where towns grew and fortunes were made. Clara returned to Mrs. Abernathy's house and retrieved her father's surveying tools from her trunk. The brass instruments gleamed in the morning sunlight as she set up the transit with practiced efficiency. Her movements were precise, economical. Years of watching her father work had taught her that surveying was part mathematics, part artistry. The land told stories to those who knew how to listen. She sighted through the instrument and called out measurements that settled the dispute within minutes. The boundary line ran exactly where she had indicated, giving each merchant clear title to their respective properties without overlap or conflict. Harwell and Morrison shook hands grudgingly, but their relief was obvious. Violence had been averted through knowledge rather than gunfire. Several townspeople nodded approvingly as Clara packed away her instruments with the same care her father had shown. Tucker's face darkened as he watched Clara gain respect from the same crowd that had rejected her the day before. His whispered conversation with Gideon grew more urgent, but the rancher was studying Clara with new interest. You did railroad surveying? I learned from the best. My father mapped half the Colorado Territory before he died. Gideon's ranch struggled partly because he had never properly surveyed his boundaries or water sources. Most homesteaders guessed at property lines and hoped for the best. Clara's skills could solve problems that threatened his entire operation. Mrs. Abernathy beamed with pride as neighbors complimented Clara's work. The preacher's wife had recognized quality beneath surface prejudices, and her judgment was proving correct. That afternoon, Gideon approached Clara outside the parsonage. His massive frame seemed less intimidating when he removed his hat and spoke quietly. My ranch needs proper surveying, water rights, boundary lines, the whole mess. I could pay fair wages for professional work. Clara studied his weathered face for signs of the disgust she had seen yesterday. Instead, she found grudging respect and something that might become partnership given time. This was not the arrangement either of them had expected, but it offered possibilities that a traditional marriage never could. I work as an equal partner, not hired help. Fair enough. Tucker materialized beside them like smoke, his banker's smile strained. Sam, surely you can find more suitable help. I know contractors in Denver who could handle any surveying needs. Gideon looked from Tucker to Clara, weighing options that would determine more than just ranch boundaries. Clara held her breath, knowing this decision would either establish her future in Redemption Falls or end it before it truly began. Gideon's ranch stretched across rolling hills that should have been green with prosperity. Instead, Clara found dying cattle clustered around a muddy waterhole, while acres of good grazing land sat unused. Poor planning had turned potential wealth into struggle. She set up her transit near the main house, a sturdy structure that spoke of ambition, hampered by inexperience. Gideon watched from the porch as she began her systematic survey of his property boundaries. His initial skepticism had given way to genuine curiosity about her methods. The work consumed 3 days. Clara mapped every acre with mathematical precision, noting elevation changes, water sources, and soil quality that previous surveys had ignored. Her father's training served her well as she translated landscape into numbers that revealed hidden truths. On the 4th morning, she made the discovery that would change everything. Her measurements indicated an underground water source running directly beneath Gideon's eastern pasture. The spring that fed his current water hole was merely overflow from a much larger aquifer. Properly tapped, this hidden river could irrigate thousands of acres and support 10 times his current livestock. Clara's hands trembled as she verified her calculations. Water meant life in desert country. Men killed for reliable sources that could turn wasteland into agricultural gold. Gideon's struggling ranch sat on a fortune he had never known existed. She found him mending fence near the barn, sweat staining his shirt as he wrestled with stubborn wire. His movements were economical, practiced. This was a man who understood hard work, even if he lacked technical knowledge to maximize his efforts. Your eastern pasture sits on a major aquifer. Drill 30 feet down, and you'll have water enough for 1,000 head of cattle. Gideon straightened slowly, wire cutters forgotten in his hands. You're certain? Clara showed him her calculations, pointing to elevation markers and geological indicators that painted a clear picture. Her father had taught her to read underground water like surface streams, following invisible paths that determined where communities thrived or withered. That evening, they rode together across the eastern pasture as sunset painted the hills gold and crimson. Clara pointed out subtle signs that revealed the water's presence. Certain plants that grew only above aquifers, rock formations that indicated underground flow patterns, knowledge that transformed empty land into valuable resource. Their professional partnership had evolved into something deeper during hours spent mapping his property. Gideon treated her as an equal, seeking her opinions and respecting her expertise. Clara found herself relaxing around him in ways she had never experienced with other men. He was different from the Denver society gentleman who had courted Margaret while treating Clara like furniture. Gideon's respect was earned through competence, rather than granted through social position. His hands were calloused from honest work, and his word carried weight because he kept promises. The water discovery created immediate complications. Clara's survey also revealed that Gideon's property extended further south than he had realized, encompassing valuable grazing land he had never used. Previous surveys had shortchanged him by nearly 200 acres. More troubling was what lay beyond his southern boundary. Clara's father's old railroad maps showed geological markers suggesting oil deposits throughout the region. The same underground formations that created the aquifer might also hold petroleum that could dwarf even water's value. Tucker appeared at the ranch the next morning, riding a horse too fine for casual visits. His banker's intuition had detected opportunity, and he came prepared with offers that sounded generous but felt predatory. Sam, I've been thinking about your situation. Cash flow problems, uncertain markets. I could take this property off your hands for a fair price, save you from bankruptcy. Clara watched from the porch as Gideon considered Tucker's proposal. The banker had no knowledge of her discoveries, but his timing suggested information sources that made her uneasy. Someone had told him about her survey work. What's fair in your estimation? Tucker named a figure that represented perhaps 1/10 of the land's actual value once the water source was developed. Clara's jaw clenched as she recognized manipulation disguised as friendship. The banker was positioning himself to steal a fortune through Gideon's ignorance. Gideon glanced toward Clara, seeking her assessment. Their partnership had grown strong enough that he trusted her judgment over Tucker's financial expertise. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, warning him away from the banker's trap. I'll think on it. Tucker's smile tightened with frustration. He had expected easy acceptance from a desperate rancher, not careful consideration guided by outside counsel. His eyes fixed on Clara with undisguised hostility. You'd be wise not to let certain influences cloud your business judgment, Sam. After Tucker rode away, Clara showed Gideon her calculations of the property's true value. With proper development, his ranch could become one of the territory's most profitable operations. The water alone justified rejecting any buyout offers, while potential oil deposits made selling tantamount to theft. They stood together in the eastern pasture, watching cattle graze above hidden wealth that could transform both their lives. Partnership had grown into something approaching love, built on mutual respect and shared dreams rather than social obligation. Clara's telegram arrived that afternoon, delivered by a nervous boy from the general store. Margaret was coming to Redemption Falls, with legal documents demanding Clara's immediate return to Denver. The message was brief, but ominous, threatening legal action if Clara refused compliance. Gideon read the telegram over Clara's shoulder, his jaw setting with determination. "She can't force you back." Clara was not so certain. Margaret had connections and lawyers, while Clara had only her skills and growing reputation in a frontier town. Legal battles favored those with resources and social standing, advantages her stepsister possessed in abundance. More worrying was the telegram's timing, arriving just as Tucker had made his buyout offer. Coincidences were rare in Clara's experience, especially when large sums of money were involved. Margaret Larson arrived on Tuesday's stagecoach, wearing her finest traveling dress and an expression of righteous indignation. She swept into Redemption Falls like a golden hurricane, immediately commanding attention from every man within 50 yards. This was the bride they had expected, beautiful and pale and proper, in all the ways Clara was not. She took rooms at Tucker's boarding house, the finest accommodations available in town. Within hours, she had positioned herself as the victim of Clara's deception, weaving a story of theft and betrayal that painted her stepsister as a criminal who had fled Denver with stolen property. Clara watched from Mrs. Abernathy's kitchen window as Margaret held court in the town square. Her stepsister's performance was masterful, drawing sympathy from the same people who had begun to respect Clara's contributions. Old prejudices stirred beneath the surface, ready to resurface at Margaret's careful prompting. The legal documents Margaret produced seemed impressive to folks unaccustomed to reading contracts and property deeds. She claimed Clara had stolen surveying maps and instruments that belonged to the Larson family estate, fleeing west to avoid prosecution for theft. The papers bore official seals that looked authentic enough to convince people who wanted to believe the worst about Clara. Tucker supported Margaret's claims with the enthusiasm of a man who saw opportunity in chaos. He vouched for her character and offered his banking expertise to resolve the legal complications. His sudden partnership with Margaret struck Clara as suspiciously convenient, but proving conspiracy required evidence she did not possess. Gideon found Clara that evening, pacing the parsonage parlor like a caged animal. Her usual composure had cracked under the pressure of Margaret's assault on her reputation and livelihood. Everything she had built in Redemption Falls was crumbling beneath her stepsister's calculated lies. "The maps were my father's work, not the Larson family's. But I have no way to prove ownership without documents that burned in the Denver fire 3 years ago. The fire had consumed the railroad office where her father's records were stored, along with any proof of Clara's legitimate inheritance. Margaret had waited until evidence was destroyed before making her move, timing the attack with lawyer's precision." Mrs. Abernathy entered the parlor carrying coffee and grim news from her afternoon errands. "Half the town's already convinced you're a thief. Margaret's story sounds reasonable to folks who don't know you well." The conspiracy was working perfectly. Margaret had arrived with legal papers and Tucker's backing, while Clara had only her word against mounting accusations. Even people who had benefited from Clara's surveying work were beginning to question her honesty. That night, Clara lay awake, analyzing Margaret's claims for inconsistencies. Her stepsister's story contained details that did not align with actual events, but proving those discrepancies required intimate knowledge of the Larson household that outsiders could not verify. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Abernathy discovered a cache of letters while cleaning Tucker's boarding house rooms. The correspondence dated back 3 months, revealing extensive communication between Margaret and Tucker that began long before Clara's arrival in Redemption Falls. Clara studied the letters with growing amazement at the scope of Margaret's deception. Her stepsister had contacted Tucker after discovering Clara's surveying maps, proposing a partnership that would eliminate Clara while profiting from her knowledge. The plan had been months in the making, carefully orchestrated to ensure success. Margaret's letters revealed she had never intended to honor her mail-order marriage arrangement. Instead, she had researched Redemption Falls' economic situation and identified Tucker as someone who could help her exploit Clara's surveying expertise. Sending Clara west was not charity, but strategic removal of an obstacle to profit. The correspondence outlined their entire scheme. Tucker would gain access to Clara's geological knowledge, while Margaret claimed ownership of her father's maps and instruments. Together, they would buy up valuable land, using information Clara had unwittingly provided through her surveying work. Gideon's ranch was their primary target. Tucker had known about the water source before making his buyout offer, learning of it through Margaret's advance intelligence about Clara's capabilities. His generous price was calculated to seem fair, while stealing a fortune in hidden resources. Clara's hands shook as she read Margaret's casual dismissal of her character and capabilities. Her stepsister viewed her as a useful tool to be discarded once her knowledge had been extracted and monetized. Years of subtle cruelty in the Larson household had been preparation for this final betrayal. The evidence was damning, but dangerous. Tucker controlled the bank and held influence over many townspeople's financial futures. Accusations against him could backfire if not presented carefully to the right audience. Clara needed allies who valued justice over economic convenience. Mrs. Abernathy proved invaluable in building support among the town's more principled citizens. She shared the letters discreetly with people who had benefited from Clara's honest work, building a coalition of supporters who understood the difference between appearance and character. Harwell and Morrison, the merchants whose boundary dispute Clara had resolved, became vocal advocates for her integrity. Several other townspeople who had received fair treatment from Clara joined their cause, creating a counterweight to Margaret and Tucker's influence. The confrontation was building toward an inevitable climax. Margaret had legal documents and Tucker's banking power, while Clara possessed evidence of their conspiracy and growing community support. The battle for truth would determine not only Clara's fate, but the character of Redemption Falls itself. Gideon stood firmly beside Clara as accusations and counter-accusations filled the town with tension. Their partnership had evolved into love, built on mutual respect and shared values, strong enough to withstand external pressure from those who profited from injustice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the truth about all of them. The town meeting convened in the church on Saturday morning, drawing every adult resident of Redemption Falls. Mrs. Abernathy had arranged the gathering under the pretense of resolving Clara's legal situation, but everyone understood this was really a trial that would determine the community's soul. Margaret sat in the front pew wearing her finest dress, legal documents arranged neatly beside her like weapons prepared for battle. Tucker occupied the seat of honor near the makeshift podium, his banker's authority lending weight to Margaret's claims. They presented a picture of respectable society confronting frontier lawlessness. Clara entered with Gideon at her side, carrying her father's surveying instruments and the cache of letters Mrs. Abernathy had discovered. Her supporters filled the back pews, a diverse collection of townspeople who had benefited from her honest work. The division in the room was stark and unmistakable. Reverend Abernathy called the meeting to order with the gravity befitting a man of God presiding over earthly justice. His wife had briefed him thoroughly on the evidence Clara possessed, preparing him for the delicate task of ensuring fair hearing, despite the accusations flying from both sides. Margaret rose first, her performance polished by years of drawing-room training. She painted herself as the wronged sister, forced to pursue Clara across dangerous territory to recover stolen family property. Her tears seemed genuine to those who did not know her capacity for manipulation. Clara fled Denver with documents and instruments that belonged to our late father's estate. These surveying tools represent my family's entire inheritance, stolen by someone we trusted and sheltered out of Christian charity. The legal papers she produced looked official enough to impress people unfamiliar with court documents. Margaret had invested considerable time and money creating convincing forgeries that supported her version of events. The seals and signatures appeared authentic to untrained eyes. Tucker rose to support Margaret's claims, lending his financial expertise to validate the documents. His reputation in the community carried weight with folks who depended on his bank for their economic survival. Opposition to Tucker meant risking future loans and business relationships. I've examined Miss Larson's papers thoroughly. Everything appears proper and legally binding. The instruments in question clearly belong to the Larson estate, not to someone who worked as a servant in their household. The implication was clear and calculated. Clara was portrayed as overreaching servant who had stolen from her betters, then fled west to escape justice. The narrative played into existing prejudices about people who did not know their proper place in society's hierarchy. Clara felt the mood in the room shifting against her as Margaret's performance reached its emotional climax. Her stepsister had always possessed a talent for making others see her as the victim, regardless of actual circumstances. Years of practice in Denver society had honed this skill to devastating effectiveness. When Clara rose to respond, she carried herself with quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Margaret's theatrical display. She had learned from her father that truth required no embellishment, only clear presentation of verifiable facts. The letters would speak more eloquently than any emotional appeal. These correspondence records tell a different story about Miss Larson's intentions and honesty. She began reading selected passages from Margaret's letters to Tucker, her voice steady despite the explosive nature of the revelations. The room grew silent as the scope of the conspiracy became clear through Margaret's own words. The letters revealed Margaret had contacted Tucker months before Clara's arrival, proposing their partnership after discovering Clara's surveying capabilities. References to Clara as a useful tool to be exploited and discarded demonstrated Margaret's true feelings about her stepsister's welfare. Most damaging was Margaret's casual admission that she had never intended to honor her mail-order marriage commitment. Instead, she had researched Redemption Falls' economic situation and identified Tucker as someone who could help monetize Clara's geological knowledge without compensating Clara for her expertise. Tucker's face drained of color as his financial records were produced, showing suspicious land purchases that coincided perfectly with Margaret's letters. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, revealing a coordinated effort to profit from insider information about land values. Margaret attempted to discredit the letters as forgeries, but her desperation showed in increasingly frantic denials. The handwriting matched samples of her correspondence with local businesses, and the intimate knowledge of Denver society displayed in the letters could only have come from someone with Margaret's background and connections. Gideon stood to address the assembly, his massive frame commanding attention from even Margaret's supporters. His reputation for honesty carried weight in a community that valued straight dealing above social polish. Clara's surveying work has been nothing but professional and fair. She solved the Harwell-Morrison boundary dispute without favoring either side. Her survey of my ranch was accurate down to the foot, revealing resources I never knew existed. Harwell and Morrison rose to confirm Gideon's testimony, followed by other townspeople who had benefited from Clara's honest work. Their collective voice created a powerful counter-argument to Margaret and Tucker's accusations, demonstrating Clara's character through actions rather than words. Mrs. Abernathy provided crucial testimony about discovering the letters, explaining her concerns about inconsistencies in Margaret's story that had prompted her investigation. Her reputation for Christian charity and truthfulness lent credibility to evidence that might otherwise have been dismissed. The tide was turning as Clara's supporters outnumbered Margaret's dwindling allies. Tucker's financial influence meant less when his dishonesty was exposed through his own correspondence. Even people who had initially supported Margaret began questioning her version of events. Margaret's final gambit was an emotional appeal to racial prejudice, suggesting that Clara had manipulated good Christian folk through deception and cunning. The attack was desperate and ugly, revealing the hatred that had always lurked beneath her surface charm. The room erupted in angry voices as the community confronted its own conscience through Margaret's naked bigotry. The church fell silent after Margaret's ugly outburst revealed the hatred that had driven her conspiracy. Her mask of respectability had cracked completely, exposing the calculating cruelty that Clara had endured for years in the Larson household. Even Tucker looked uncomfortable with his partner's naked bigotry. Reverend Abernathy stood slowly, his weathered face grave with disappointment at what he had witnessed. His voice carried the moral authority that came from decades of guiding his community through difficult decisions. "We have heard evidence of deception, conspiracy, and theft. The letters speak clearly about Miss Larson's intentions and Mr. Tucker's participation in this scheme. More importantly, we have seen the character of all involved through their actions in our community." The vote was swift and decisive. 23 residents supported Clara, while only 7 stood with Margaret and Tucker. Even some of Tucker's business associates could not stomach the evidence of his corruption and Margaret's manipulative lies. Margaret's legal documents were declared fraudulent based on the contradictory evidence in her own correspondence. Her claim to Clara's inheritance was rejected by community consensus, leaving her without legal standing to force Clara's return to Denver. The surveying instruments and maps were confirmed as Clara's rightful property. Tucker faced immediate consequences for his banking improprieties. A committee was formed to audit his financial records and remove him from positions of authority. His land speculation scheme had violated the trust placed in him by depositors who expected honest stewardship of their resources. Margaret left Redemption Falls that afternoon on the eastbound stagecoach, her grand plan reduced to ashes by Clara's patient accumulation of evidence. Her parting glare promised future revenge, but Clara felt only relief at her stepsister's departure. Years of psychological torment were finally ending. Tucker's downfall came swiftly once his corruption was exposed. The Territorial Banking Commission arrived within 2 weeks to investigate his activities and assume control of the institution. His fraudulent land purchases were reversed, and he faced criminal charges for embezzlement and conspiracy. Clara's surveying business flourished as word spread throughout the territory about her professional competence and ethical standards. Ranchers and merchants sought her services for boundary disputes and resource development, creating a steady income that ensured her independence. The discovery of water on Gideon's ranch transformed his struggling operation into one of the region's most prosperous cattle operations. Clara's geological surveys identified additional resources that attracted railroad interest and mining investments, bringing prosperity to the entire community. Their professional partnership evolved naturally into personal commitment, built on mutual respect and shared goals. Clara had found what she never dared hope for during her years of servitude, a relationship between equals who valued each other's contributions and character. The wedding took place on a crisp autumn morning in the same church where Clara's character had been vindicated months earlier. Mrs. Abernathy had organized the celebration with the enthusiasm of someone who had recognized Clara's worth from their first meeting. The entire community attended, demonstrating their acceptance of Clara as a valued member. Clara wore a simple dress that reflected her practical nature, while carrying a bouquet of desert wildflowers that symbolized her ability to thrive in harsh conditions. Gideon stood beside her in his finest suit, his weathered hands gentle as they exchanged vows that promised partnership rather than possession. Reverend Abernathy performed the ceremony with joy, blessing a union that had grown from mutual respect rather than social obligation. His words emphasized the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances to recognize the character that determined true worth. The reception continued late into the evening as neighbors celebrated a love story that had triumphed over prejudice and conspiracy. Clara's transformation from rejected mail-order bride to respected businesswoman and beloved community member inspired others to reconsider their own assumptions about human worth. Clara's surveying business expanded beyond simple boundary work to comprehensive land development consultation. Her geological expertise proved invaluable as the territory attracted railroad investment and mining operations. She became the first licensed female surveyor in Arizona Territory, opening doors for other women to enter professional fields. Gideon's ranch became a model operation that demonstrated how scientific surveying could maximize natural resources while maintaining environmental balance. Their water management techniques were copied throughout the region, helping other ranchers achieve sustainable prosperity. The couple's home became a refuge for travelers who faced discrimination or hardship on the frontier. Clara remembered her own desperate arrival in Redemption Falls and ensured others received the kindness that Mrs. Abernathy had shown her. Their hospitality created a network of support that strengthened the entire community. Years later, Clara stood in her surveying office, reviewing maps that showed the territory's transformation from scattered settlements to thriving communities connected by railroads and irrigation systems. Her work had contributed to progress that benefited everyone, regardless of background or social status. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Another stagecoach had arrived carrying a young woman whose circumstances echoed Clara's own arrival years earlier. The newcomer faced rejection and suspicion from people who judged by appearance rather than character. Clara gathered her surveying instruments and prepared to offer assistance to someone who needed guidance and support. Her own journey from desperation to prosperity had taught her the importance of helping others recognize their own worth and potential. The cycle continued as Clara extended the same grace she had received from Mrs. Abernathy and others who had seen past surface appearances to recognize human dignity. Redemption Falls had earned its name through Clara's influence, becoming a place where character mattered more than circumstances. Her father's surveying tools gleamed in the afternoon sunlight as Clara prepared for another day of work that would help someone else find their place in an often hostile world.